lonely woodsman took in a pregnant girl sold by her brother. What he found was more than a family. The trail wound through a stretch of dying summer grass, curled and pale like parchment left too long in the sun. Heat shimmered above the dirt, and the only sound was the distant croak of crow and the soft, reluctant crunch of boots too thin for long travel. She walked with her head down, arms cradling the rise of her stomach, her breath hitching not from exertion, but from what waited at the end of the road. Beside her, a man rode on a lean chestnut horse, the rein slung lazy in one hand, his eyes flicking toward her now and then like he was trying to feel something but couldn't find the right thread. Her brother hadn't spoken in over an hour, not since they passed the burned-out mill, and he muttered something about this being her best chance. He hadn't looked at her since. Up ahead, the pines began, thick, tall, and old enough to remember names no one said aloud anymore. Beyond them, tucked where the hills rose into shadow, a cabin stood with smoke curling from its chimney. Not much of a home, really. The boards looked hand-hewn, not quite even. The porch leaned just slightly, like it had settled into sorrow. But there was a fence, half-mended, a garden that still remembered Rose. And someone there, someone who cut trees and lived alone and didn't ask for company. The brother dismounted, took her by the wrist, and pulled her forward like a sack being handed off. She didn't resist. Resistance was a language that had failed her before. Better to go quiet. Better to disappear with grace than scream with no audience. The man who answered the knock didn't speak for a long while, just stood in the doorway, axe still in hand, eyes squinting under the weight of low sun and years of silence. He was tall, not clean, but not filthy either. His beard was full and salt-stitched. There was something about him that suggested he'd grown up beside the trees and never left. "She's yours if you'll have her," her brother said, with a smirk that tried to cover guilt. "Pregnant. Can cook. Won't complain." The girl looked up at the woodsman, her mouth dry, her fingers trembling. She hated the way her belly led her now, how it spoke before she did. The woodsman looked past the brother, past the girl, into the trees, as if he were listening to something older than all of them. Then quietly he said, "What's her name?" The brother scoffed. "Ain't that important." But the girl answered, "Mabel." The name fell soft, unused, like a song remembered after years of forgetting. She hadn't said it aloud in weeks, maybe longer. The woodsman nodded once, slow, then stepped back and opened the door. The brother dropped the rope, like it had never been his to begin with. He swung onto his horse and rode off without a word, his silhouette shrinking into the orange burn of dusk. Mabel didn't move. She stood at the threshold, heart thudding in her chest, the scent of cedar and smoke filtering past him from inside. "You can stay," the woodsman said, his voice more bark than music, but not unkind. "If you want." She stepped in. The inside was simple, sparse. A cot, a stove, a table with 2 chairs. One looked less worn than the other. The hearth had a fire going, not large but steady. There was a bowl on the table. Bread and beans. No garnish. No show. She didn't ask where she would sleep. She didn't ask what he expected in return. He didn't offer rules or warnings. That night, she lay on a rolled blanket near the hearth, her hands over the curve of her belly. The baby shifted once, like it too was trying to find comfort in a world too hard for softness. She didn't cry. There were no tears left to fall, only a hollow ache that moved where her dreams used to live. The woodsman didn't speak again that night. He sat in the darker corner of the room, whittling something, a spoon maybe, the shavings catching in his lap like snow. Now and then he looked toward her, but only briefly, like one might glance toward a window, to make sure the storm hadn't changed its path. Morning came with gray skies and the hush of fog between trees. Mabel rose early, unsure of the rhythm here, unwilling to seem idle. She found a bucket and fetched water. She swept the porch. She reheated last night's beans. When he emerged from the back room, she handed him a mug of weak coffee and waited for judgment. He took it without a word and drank. They worked in silence most days. She stitched a rip in a curtain, washed clothes by hand. He chopped wood, repaired a fence, walked into the trees, and returned with deer meat or kindling or simply sap on his hands. He never asked about her belly, though now and then his eyes lingered on it with a look not of curiosity but quiet consideration, like he was trying to picture what kind of future could grow from pain. One evening, after 5 days of unspoken living, she broke the silence. "Why do you live so far from town?" He didn't look at her, just poked the fire. "Town's too loud," he said finally. "People too quick to judge what they never sat close enough to understand." She nodded, not because she understood him, but because she understood the feeling. Later, when she washed her dress in the river behind the cabin, she saw her reflection in the water, pale, thin, eyes rimmed with sleep and fear. She whispered to herself, "Asterisk, you are not ruined. You are not gone." Asterisk, words a midwife once told her mother after losing a child. The baby kicked again. She smiled for the first time in weeks. Just barely. The woodsman brought her a blanket that night, softer than the first, said nothing as he handed it over. She murmured a thank you and saw, for the first time, his expression shift. Not soften, not brighten, but shift like a tree leaning into wind instead of standing against it. Time passed away it does in quiet places, slow and full of unnoticed change. Her belly grew. The air cooled. He added a second mug to the hook above the stove, without ceremony. She moved from floor to cot when he began sleeping on the porch. Neither discussed the change. One morning, she found an old baby cradle outside the shed, dusty and used, carved long ago. She wiped it clean with trembling hands. He watched from a window, but didn't interrupt. She knew then, without being told, that he had lost something once, and maybe, just maybe, wasn't ready to lose again. On the 11th day, as the wind turned from dry to sweet, and the trees dropped their first leaves like soft-spoken farewells, Mabel stepped out onto the porch, wrapped in a shawl, and sat beside the woodsman. Not close, but not far. The silence between them was different now. Not empty, but filled with things not yet said. He offered her a slice of bread. She took it. The sun dipped low, staining the sky in blood orange and ash. "You ever think things happen for a reason?" she asked, not looking at him. He considered, took his time. "Maybe," he said, "or maybe we just give M reason so we can stand to remember." She turned to him then, fully, her eyes searching. "I don't want to be something someone traded anymore." His gaze didn't waver. "Then don't be." She nodded. The wind rustled the trees, and somewhere far off, a wolf howled like it was mourning the moon. But here, on this porch, in the hush between loss and something like beginning, two people sat with no promises, no names for what they were, only the truth that both had stayed. And neither was quite alone anymore. Morning drifted in soft and slow, the way snow falls before the world wakes. Mabel stood by the stove, stirring oats in a blackened pot, the steam curling like spirits from another life. Outside, the woodsman split logs with quiet rhythm, each crack echoing into the pines like a heartbeat made of wood and will. 2 cups sat on the table. The second one hadn't always been there. It had appeared one morning, plain and chipped, mismatched to the other, but equal in presence. He never explained its arrival. She never asked. But each day now, 2 cups were filled, and the silence between them seemed warmer somehow. Mabel's belly grew, taut and full, rounding like a promise she still wasn't sure she wanted to keep. Some days it frightened her. Some days it gave her purpose. Most days it simply ached. But here under this roof, with only trees and wind to listen, she began to feel less like a burden and more like a being. The woodsman, whose name she had learned was Eli, continued his life with gentle consistency. He said little, slept little, carved small wooden things when he wasn't working, spoons, birds, once a tiny horse she caught him hiding in a drawer. He was a man built from patience. He never asked her past, never touched her without cause. And still, there were moments when his presence filled the room like music no one dared him aloud. She swept the floors, hung linens to dry, planted sprigs of mint along the back fence. She hadn't gardened since childhood. Her mother had once grown lavender in window boxes. The memory bloomed sharp and sweet, like a ghost at her elbow. Eli brought her a chair for the porch. Nothing fancy, just something solid. He nodded toward it like it had always been hers. She sat most afternoons now, wrapped in wool, eyes tracing the treetops where the wind played its quiet games. "I dreamed of running once," she told him one evening as dusk painted the sky an ashen blush. "Far as I could, barefoot and breathless. Thought if I got far enough, I'd be new." He didn't answer, just passed her a mug and leaned back against the railing. "But you can't outrun what you carry inside," she said mostly to herself. "No," he said softly, "but sometimes you can put it down." The words landed like seeds in tilled soil. She let them settle. That night, she found a quilt folded neatly at the foot of her cot. It wasn't hers. The stitching was rough, the pattern uneven, but it was warm, hand-sewn, intentional. She lay beneath it, fingers tracing the seams, and wondered if it had belonged to someone else before her, or if he'd made it just for now. The days moved like water, slow, unhurried, with little ripples of change. Mabel began speaking more, telling stories. Little ones, at first, her favorite book as a girl, the way her father used to sing when he drank, the name she'd chosen for the child if it came out with a cry instead of silence. "Clara," she said one morning, after my grandmother. She had a spine of steel and hands like velvet. Said love wasn't loud, it was steady. Eli only nodded, but something in his face softened, like bark warmed by sun. They didn't speak of the child's father. Not once. That chapter remained closed, locked and buried. But Mabel noticed that Eli always left the kettle on longer now, and every night before bed, he checked the latch on the door twice. A visitor came one crisp afternoon, kicking up dust as her horse clopped into yard. She was a widow from downriver, Mrs. Calloway, gray-haired and sharp-eyed, with a tongue that could skin a tree. She brought cornbread and questions. "Well, I'll be," she said, eyeing Mabel's round belly and weather-worn dress. "Eli, you taking up keeping company now?" He said nothing, only gestured for her to sit. Mrs. Calloway leaned in, speaking in a half-whisper meant to be overheard. "They're talking in town, you know. Say you got a girl up here with no name and no ring. Say she's trouble." Mabel tensed. Her fingers clenched the edge of her apron. Eli sipped his tea and replied. They talked before. Didn't stop the snow from falling. The widow blinked, then chuckled. "Still a man of few words, I see." Later, after she left, Mabel stood by the window watching her ride off. "Do you care what they say?" Eli shook his head. "The trees say more and they don't lie." She smiled at that. It was the kind of thing her grandmother would have written on a scrap of paper and tucked into her Bible. One evening, a windstorm blew in, sudden and fierce. Shutters clattered. Branches scraped the roof like restless fingers. Mabel couldn't sleep. She paced the cabin, cradling her belly, heart thudding with every gust. The storm reminded her of other nights, nights when doors slammed and footsteps meant fear. Eli didn't sleep either. He lit the lantern low and sat by the fire, carving something small and quiet in his lap. She walked to him, sat on the floor nearby. "I used to pray during storms," she whispered. "Not for safety. Just for someone to notice I was afraid." He looked up, met her eyes. "You don't have to be afraid here." Tears welled before she could stop them. Not from fear. From the fact that someone had said it and meant it, without asking anything in return. She didn't cry loudly, just sat there, quiet, as the wind rattled the walls and the fire burned low. When morning came, the storm had passed. The world outside was washed clean, leaves scattered like gold coins on the ground. The air smelled of pine and rain. She stepped out onto the porch, barefoot, and let the cold bite her skin. Eli joined her with 2 mugs in hand. They drank in silence, steam rising, the quiet between them no longer empty but full of shared breath. That day, she found a cradle in the shed. She didn't know what made her go in, maybe curiosity, maybe instinct. But there it was, tucked beneath an old tarp, hand-carved and worn smooth with time. Dust covered the rails. A spider had built its home in one corner. Still, it was beautiful. She dragged it out into the light, brushed it clean with the hem of her dress, ran her hands over the edges, over initials she didn't recognize. Eli watched from the porch. "Yours?" she asked. "No," he said after a pause. "Someone I knew once." She didn't push, just nodded, understanding more in that moment than any story could tell. That night, she placed the cradle by the hearth, set a folded cloth inside it, and sat beside it for a long while. "You think she'll be okay?" she asked. Eli didn't ask who she meant. He knew. "I think she's got a better chance than most." Mabel closed her eyes. The wind sighed through the trees. The fire crackled low. She felt the baby kick and smiled, hand resting gently on her belly. There was no thunder now, no boots at the door, no voices raised in anger, just the steady breath of a man who kept his promises by showing up, and a house that now knew the sound of 2 cups being filled each morning. It wasn't a love story yet, but it was becoming something that might last longer. And in the wild silence of those hills, something tender had taken root. Small, quiet, and alive. Snow came soft as breath, laying itself over the cabin roof in a hush that swallowed sound. The world beyond the trees turned white and still, as if nature herself had paused to listen. Inside, the fire glowed low and steady. Mabel sat by the hearth, her hands wrapped around a cup of tea gone lukewarm, her belly rounding out in front of her like a moon nearing fullness. Eli sat in his usual place near the window, a piece of cedar in his hand, and his knife working slow, careful curves into its grain. They had fallen into a rhythm, the two of them, measured, wordless, but not empty. Each day passed with shared glances, small acts, the occasional murmured sentence. He repaired a broken shutter. She mended the hem of his coat. When the baby kicked, she smiled without looking up, and sometimes he'd glance over, saying nothing, yet she could feel him listening. The snow thickened. It clung to the branches like cotton and bent the pines into slow bows. It sealed them inside for days, until the trail to the nearest town disappeared beneath drifts too deep for travel. The cabin became their whole world, every wall holding the breath of what had not yet been said. Mabel began reading again. She found a book in Eli's cupboard, poems yellowed and crumbling. She read aloud sometimes, unsure if he cared, but he never asked her to stop. His carving was slow, just a little, and now and then, when the lines were soft enough, he'd close his eyes as if tracing the words in his mind. She read by firelight one evening, her voice quiet but sure. "Love is not a thing that strikes," she read. "It waits. It watches. It warms." Eli looked up, met her gaze. A long pause stretched between them, full of the things they hadn't yet named. That night, she dreamt of her mother, her arms strong, her eyes full of something she couldn't quite name. In the dream, her mother said nothing. She only held Mabel close, pressed her cheek against her hair, and vanished like smoke. When she woke, her face was wet. She didn't tell Eli, but that morning, he left a folded cloth on her cot, embroidered, with soft blue flowers stitched in thread too fine for his thick fingers. A woman's work, perhaps, a past not asked about, a kindness not spoken. The days passed slow, marked by the sound of fire and the shifting of her breath. The baby grew restless. Mabel's body ached with the weight of it. Her feet swelled, her back bent, but she moved. She worked, she waited, and in the quiet, she began to feel the sharp edges of her life smooth down, like river stones left long enough in water. One night, a storm swept through, fierce and sudden. Wind howled down the chimney, rattled the windows like fists on old glass. Mabel stood by the fire, her hand on her belly, the fear curling up her spine like smoke. She remembered other storms, ones filled with slamming doors and cruel voices, nights when she'd prayed not for safety, but for silence. This one was different. Eli came in from the porch, snow melting on his coat. He peeled off his gloves, his boots, moved the hearth and stoked the flames higher. Then he sat beside her, not close enough to touch, but near enough to share the heat. She sat down slowly, her body stiff. "I'm scared," she said, her voice barely there. He nodded once, eyes on the fire. "I ain't strong like her," she whispered. "My grandmother, or my mother, I feel like a window held together with thread." Eli looked at her then, Not as someone broken, but someone brave enough to speak her cracks aloud. "Glass doesn't hold the light," he said, "unless it's clear enough to let it through." The words settled over her like a blanket, quiet and warm. "I don't know how to be someone's mother," she said. "Start by staying," he replied. "The rest will come." She cried then, not loud, not desperate, just tears that rolled slow and full of relief. And he didn't turn away. He sat with her as the storm howled, and the fire danced, and the cradle rocked empty beside them. In the days that followed, the storm passed, but something between them had shifted, not with words or gestures, but with presence. She began to feel safe not just in the house, but in herself. She sewed small clothes in the afternoon light. Eli built shelves for books she hadn't yet asked for. Once, she caught him watching her with a softness that frightened her more than any storm, because in that gaze there was no pity, only recognition. One evening, the fire cracked and popped as she stirred a pot of stew. The baby kicked hard, enough to make her gasp. She sat, breath short, hands braced. Eli moved closer, the lines in his brow deepening. "You all right?" She nodded, then shook her head. "It's just, I don't want to do this alone." "You're not," he said, and the way he said it, quiet, steady, without promise but full of truth, made her chest ache. She looked at him, saw the way the firelight gilded the scars on his hands, the silver threading through his beard, the way his eyes held shadows, and still managed to be kind. "Why are you kind to me?" she asked, not bitterly, but with wonder. He didn't answer right away. When he did, it was barely above a breath. Because someone should have been. Later that night, she found a bundle on the table, wrapped in old linen. Inside were a pair of soft boots, tiny as a sparrow, and a blanket woven thick and clean. "I made them," he said, and left her alone with the bundle. Mabel stood at the cradle, the fire behind her, her hand brushing the edge of it. She looked down at the tiny boots and wept, not for what she had lost, but for what she found in the quiet hush between embers and wood smoke. The baby shifted again, calm this time, as if it too could feel the change. And though the world outside remained harsh and cold, the cabin held a different warmth now. It was not love yet, but it was a shape love might take if given time. The first pain came with the wind, sharp, low, and deep enough to stop her breath. Mabel gripped the edge of the kitchen table, her fingers whitening, her eyes fixed on the snow curling past the window like ash in the sky. It had been building for days, quiet and slow, a pressure beneath her ribs and spine. Now, it rolled through her in waves, steady as the tides. Eli was stacking firewood by the shed when she called his name. Not loud, not frantic, just enough to make the air shift. He turned, saw her at the door, bent slightly, her breath fogging the cold. "She's coming," Mabel said, voice tight and steady. He didn't panic, just nodded once, dropped the wood, and came to her. Inside, the fire was already lit. He added more logs, stoked it high. She sat on the cot, her hands cradling the curve of her belly, her hair damp at the temples. The cradle sat beside the hearth now, ready. Eli filled the kettle, brought clean cloths, boiled water in the iron pot. His movements were purposeful, grounded, no tremble in his hands. Mabel breathed through another contraction, her teeth clenched, her eyes wet. "I'm scared," she whispered, the words trembling out. "I know," he said, "but you're not alone." The wind howled harder. Snow slammed against the windows. It was the worst storm of the season, thunder rumbling like giants moving across mountains. But the cabin held firm, and Eli stayed by her side. Time blurred. Pain came and went in surges, until the hours folded into one long ache. She cried out only once, a raw sound that rose and broke like a wave on rocks. He caught her hand and held it, not too tight, but enough to remind her she was still tethered to something living. She bore down, sweat slicking her brow, her breath ragged, the fire roar behind them. Then, finally, a sound. Small, wet, fragile, a cry. The baby arrived just as the storm broke its peak. Thunder cracked like bone splitting. Rain followed, washing against the roof in torrents. But inside, in the flicker of firelight, life had entered the world. Mabel fell back, breathless, weeping without knowing why. Eli held the child, tiny, red-faced, cry with lungs too small for such strength, and wrapped her in the cloth Mabel had sewn weeks ago. He placed the baby in her arms. Mabel stared down at the little face, already calming, fingers so small they could wrap around a thread of yarn. She touched the downy hair, the soft curve of the cheek. Her body shook, not from pain now, but from something deeper. Awe, relief, fear, love. "She's real," she said. "She's here." Eli knelt beside her, quiet, eyes on the child. "You did it," he said. "No," she breathed. "We did." Outside, the storm began to break. The snow slowed. The wind softened. The trees stood tall again. But peace didn't last long. A knock came, sudden and sharp, cutting to the quiet like a knife. Eli stiffened. Mabel's head jerked toward the door, her arms tightening instinctively around the child. The knock came again. He rose, slow and silent, and opened the door with the axe still leaning just behind him. There on the porch stood her brother. He looked different, thinner, eyes sunken, but the same posture, one a man who believed the world owed him something, even if he couldn't name it. "Well, look at this," he said, stepping forward as if invited. "Didn't think you'd get this far, sis." Eli blocked the door. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "I heard she had the baby. Word gets around. Came to see for myself. She doesn't want to see you." Her brother's mouth twitched. "She's my kin. That baby's blood is mine, too." "No," Mabel said from the cot, her voice cold and clear. "You sold your blood the day you traded me for coin." He laughed. "It was empty. You think this is over? You think a baby gives you some kind of power?" Eli didn't move, didn't raise his voice. Just stood like stone, hands loose at his sides. "This isn't your home," he said. "And she's not yours." Her brother's face twisted. "You think you're better than me? Think you can keep what don't belong to you?" Eli's voice was quiet. "She belongs to no one." Mabel rose slowly, cradling the baby. Her legs shook, but her eyes held fire. "I'm not property," she said. "Not yours. Not anyone's. And this child will never know the kind of fear you gave me." He looked at her, something flashing in his face. Not love, not guilt, just confusion. Like he couldn't quite believe she'd slipped beyond his reach. "Go," Eli said. Her brother glanced at the axe behind the door, the cradle near the hearth, the 2 cups on the table. He hesitated, then turned, muttering something low as he disappeared into the storm-whitened woods. Eli closed the door, latched it, checked it twice. Mabel sat down again, shaking. The baby stirred, whimpered once, then fell quiet in her arms. The fire crackled. Outside, the last of the storm passed. Eli returned to her side. "You're safe now," he said. She nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. For a long while they didn't speak, just watched the child breathe, her tiny chest rising and falling like a new world finding its rhythm. Then Mabel looked at him. "I want to name her Clara," she said, "after the woman I want to be." Eli nodded. "She'll be strong," he said. "She'll be loved." They sat there until dawn, the fire burning low, their shadows cast long on the cabin walls. 3 cups sat on the table now. The cradle was no longer empty, and the woods no longer seemed so lonely. Outside, the storm had left behind a blanket of white, unbroken and untouched. A new beginning. Something tender had been planted in that cold soil, uncertain, yes, but real. Not just a child, but something else. A seed. And in the hush that followed pain, in the warmth that follows fear, the quiet truth rose like the sun over snow. Sometimes love doesn't arrive with thunder. Sometimes it comes as a whisper, as the steady breath of someone who stays. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe and hit the bell icon so you never miss a tale from the heart of the Wild West.